a woman stands in the middle of a Wyoming street with her last gold ring in her open hand, not wearing it, holding it out. To a stranger with a badge and no conscience, in exchange for a man she has never spoken to, locked in a cage in the center of town like something the world decided it was done with. The man in the cage hasn't moved in 3 days. The crowd has stopped laughing. Something is happening they don't have a name for yet. She doesn't look at them. She doesn't look at the sheriff. She looks at the man behind the iron bars, at the only pair of eyes in Caldwell Crossing that aren't deciding what she's worth. The key turns, the door swings open, and 6'5" of silence steps out into the light. The wheel didn't just crack, it gave up, surrendered to 20 miles of Wyoming hardpan like it had been waiting for permission to quit. And now Clara Reed sat on the driver's bench of a stopped wagon, with her hands still wrapped around reins, connected to nothing useful, looking at the town of Caldwell Crossing like it owed her something. It didn't. The town looked back at her the way towns like this always did, sideways, through the corners of eyes that had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. A widow woman, alone, wagon half loaded, wheel half dead, face half covered in trail dust. She'd stopped trying to brush off somewhere around the Kansas border. She climbed down without hurrying. 20 years of doing everything without help had stripped the urgency out of small disasters. The wheel was split clean through the hub, the iron rim sitting in the dirt at an angle that made the whole wagon list like a tired drunk. She crouched beside it, pressed her palm to the splintered wood, and did the arithmetic. New wheel or repair? Repair if there was a blacksmith. New wheel if there wasn't. Either way, she wasn't moving until tomorrow morning at the earliest. A man on the boardwalk across the street laughed at something his friend said, and then looked over and laughed a little louder in her direction. Not at the wheel. At her. Clara stood up, brushed the dust off her knees, and looked at the center of town. That was when she saw the cage. Not a livestock pen. Not a holding structure for horses or mules or anything that walked on 4 legs. Iron bars, thick as a man's wrist, welded rough and rusted at the base where they met a platform of warped wood. The whole thing sat in the open square between the saloon and the land office, like someone had built it for a reason they were proud of. A board nailed to one side, hand-lettered. Clara was 30 feet away and could read it without squinting. Tend to touch the beast. Inside the cage, a man. Her first thought was that she was misreading the situation. Her second thought arrived before the first one finished, which was that she absolutely was not. He sat with his back against the iron bars on the far side, knees drawn up, arms resting on them loose and heavy, head bowed. Hair dark and long enough to hang over his face completely, so that all she could see was the shape of him. And the shape was wrong for a cage. The shape was wrong for anything that small. Even sitting down, even folded into himself like a letter that had been mailed to the wrong address and had given up on being delivered. The man took up the entire interior of that cage. His shoulders touched both sides simultaneously. His back pressed the rear bars. If he'd straightened his legs, his boots would have pushed through the front. 6 feet and some change, at minimum, maybe more. The kind of frame that made a space rearrange itself around him rather than the other way. A boy of maybe 12 threw a pine cone at the cage. It bounced off the bars. The man didn't move. Another man, red-faced and clearly 2 drinks into the afternoon, stepped close and slapped the bars with an open palm. The sound rang across the square. Still nothing. The red-faced man laughed and said something about touching the beast for free, which drew a round of appreciation from the 3 people standing nearby. Clara walked toward the cage. She wasn't sure when she decided to do that. It felt less like a decision, and more like the wheel braking had knocked loose something in her internal compass, and now she was just walking toward whatever magnetic north had become. Past the wagon, across the packed dirt of the square, through the smell of horse and wood smoke and a town that hadn't had rain in 3 weeks and had stopped apologizing for it. Someone stepped into her peripheral vision from the left, heavy, purposeful, the kind of step that belonged to a man who was used to conversations starting on his schedule. Rex Dolan was 55 years old and built like a man who had once been strong and had since converted that strength into authority. Broad through the chest, thick in the middle, wearing a vest of sheepskin that had cost real money and wanted you to know it. A cigar clamped in the corner of his mouth, unlit. He stopped beside Clara with the ease of someone who owned the ground he was standing on. And in Caldwell Crossing he more or less did. Passing through? Not a greeting, an assessment. stopping for a wheel. Clara didn't look at him. She was looking at the cage. Where are you headed? Harrow Creek. A pause. The length of it meant something. She stored that away without looking like she had. Long ride. Dolan shifted his weight. You traveling alone? Do I look like I'm traveling in a group? Dolan smiled at the side of her face. You look like a woman who could use some assistance. I know most of the businesses in town. Could make sure you're treated fairly. Clara finally looked at him. At the smile that didn't change when it reached his eyes because it hadn't come from his eyes in the first place. At the way he stood slightly angled toward her, occupying more of her space than the conversation required. I've been treated fairly before, she said. I recognize it when I see it. She turned back toward the cage and kept walking. Sheriff Harker had positioned himself against the post nearest the cage with the practiced lean of a man who was being paid to look comfortable. He was maybe 40, running to softness around the jaw, with a badge that sat slightly crooked on his vest as if it had been pinned there by someone else, and he'd never quite adjusted it. He held a stick he was using to carve nothing in particular. When Clara stopped in front of the cage, he looked at her the way men like him looked at women like her, which was the way a man looks at something he doesn't consider a problem yet. What did he do? Clara asked. Harker shrugged one shoulder. Nothing we can prove. Then what's he doing in there? Won't talk. Came down from the ridge 3 weeks back, had a dead man's saddlebag, bleeding from a cut on his side. Couldn't explain himself. Another shrug. Folks needed something to occupy their attention. Is he dangerous? Harker smiled at the cage. To who? Clara stepped to the bars, close enough that the rust smell hit her, iron and old rain and the dry straw scattered on the platform floor. Close enough to see the man's hands where they rested on his knees. Knuckles scraped, wrists wrapped in strips of what had once been a shirt. The hands themselves were extraordinary in a way she hadn't expected, large in the way that a working man's hands get large, not from violence but from years of use, from rope and timber and cold mornings. And the kind of labor that doesn't have a name because it's just called living. She didn't speak. He lifted his head. The hair fell back from his face, and Clara had a second to register what was there before she made herself not react. Not because he was frightening, because he wasn't, and that surprised her more than fear would have. A face that had taken weather like a barn takes weather, not damage, just marked. Dark eyes under a heavy brow. The kind of eyes that had been watching things from distance for so long that close range had become a foreign language. Beard thick and unkempt. A jaw that could have been carved from the same rock the cage was rusting against. He looked at her. Not the way the men in this town looked at her. Not measuring, not dismissing, not calculating. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, in a place where nothing unexpected was supposed to arrive. Careful. Attentive. Like she was information he hadn't received yet. And he was deciding whether to trust the source. Does he have a name? Clara asked without looking away from him. Harker, none we could get out of him. Can he speak? Seems like he can. Seems like he's choosing not to. Clara put her hand around one of the bars. The iron was warm from the afternoon sun, warmer than she expected. She looked at the man on the other side. And she thought about Thomas Reed, who had gone to Shiloh in April of 1862 and had not come back. And about the 2 years after that, when she had not spoken more than was necessary either, because grief does that. Grief takes the words and keeps them in a place you can't reach until one morning you wake up and you can, and even then you're not sure you want to. She thought about the ring on her finger. Thin gold, worn smooth from 17 years of daily contact with everything her hands had done. She'd kept it on through the harvests and the winters and the years when she'd done the work of 2 people with the body of 1. And she'd kept it on when Thomas's brothers had come to dispute the will and take what they could carry. And she'd kept it on during the 2 days she'd spent in the county seat, arguing over a land deed that belonged to her by law and by marriage, and by the sheer force of having stayed when Thomas left. She had kept it because it was the last thing she had that they hadn't taken. She reached into her coat pocket, found it by feel, the coin pouch empty of everything except the ring which she'd moved there when the pouch itself had become too light to wear. She pulled it free, held it up in the afternoon light. Harker saw it. His eyebrows moved. Dolan, still behind her at a distance she felt rather than measured, went very still. Will this cover what he is? Clara asked. Harker took the ring, turned it in his fingers, held it up the way a man holds something up when he's performing appraisal rather than actually assessing value. Ain't worth $10. He pocketed it. But it'll make a fine tale. He reached for the key ring at his belt. Clara turned back to the cage. The man inside was watching her with an expression she couldn't name exactly. Not surprise, not gratitude. Something quieter than both. The look of a person who has been in a place so long that the world outside it has started to feel theoretical, and now something theoretical is standing 3 feet away, and he is recalibrating. The lock turned. The door swung out with a sound like something screaming at low volume, hinges that hadn't moved in weeks protesting the change. He didn't move immediately, neither did anyone in the square. Clara waited. She wasn't going to hurry this, wasn't going to reach in and pull him out like a rescued animal, wasn't going to stand back and wave him forward like a conductor. She just waited, with her hands at her sides and her feet planted, and she said, "You can come or stay. Either way, you're not anyone's anymore." He moved. First the hands pressing flat against the platform floor, then the knees unfolding with the measured care of a man who had been still too long and was reintroducing himself to the concept of standing. Then the hips, the waist, the torso, the shoulders, and finally the full height of him telescoping upward inside the cage, until his head was above the bars and his shoulders were level with the top rail, and the afternoon sun hit his face full, and Clara understood completely why they had called him a beast, because there was no other category available to a town like this for a man built like that. 6'5", maybe more. The kind of height that doesn't announce itself with aggression but with simple, undeniable fact. He stepped through the cage door, and the crowd parted without being asked. 3 feet of clearance opening up on either side of him, like water redirecting itself around a rock that had appeared in the middle of the stream. Someone's horse, tied at the rail 20 feet away, tossed its head and pulled at the rope. He stood in the open air of Caldwell Crossing and breathed. Clara was already walking back toward the wagon. She heard his footsteps behind her, not hurrying, not hesitating, just following at a pace that matched hers without effort, which made sense given that his stride covered half again what hers did. Dolan called after her, not loud. The kind of volume a man uses when he wants to appear casual while making a point. "That land deed you're carrying to Harrow Creek, widow, it's going to be a problem." Clara didn't stop walking, only for you. She climbed onto the wagon bench. He climbed into the back. Nobody stopped them. Nobody spoke. The wheels of the wagon, the 3 intact ones and the broken one dragging its ghost, made a scraping exit from the square of Caldwell Crossing, and Clara kept her eyes on the road east and did not look back once. They traveled for an hour before the broken wheel made further movement impossible. Clara pulled the horse to a stop at a dry wash where a cluster of cottonwoods offered shade without blocking the sight lines in any direction, which she had started thinking about automatically somewhere around the 2nd year of traveling alone. She tied the horse, unloaded the repair tools, assessed the wheel with her hands and her eyes and the part of her brain that had learned carpentry from necessity rather than instruction. The man sat in the back of the wagon and watched her. She had expected him to disappear. Had thought that once the cage was open and the town was behind them, he would simply dissolve back into whatever arrangement of wilderness had produced him. Instead, he was still there, sitting with his back against the front board of the wagon bed, knees pulled up, watching her work with an attention that was thorough without being intrusive. After 10 minutes he got down. He didn't ask, didn't gesture, simply moved to the other side of the wheel, crouched, looked at the brake from a different angle, and then reached into the bed of the wagon, located the spare iron brace she'd been carrying since Missouri, and held it against the crack, in a way that demonstrated he understood exactly what she was trying to do. They fixed the wheel in silence. It took 40 minutes and cost Clara 2 broken fingernails and 1 moment of genuine frustration when the brace slipped, and she said a word Thomas would have laughed at. The man across from her made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, and then wasn't. She looked up at him. He looked away. By the time they had the wheel seated and the brace bolted, the sun was low enough to make the cottonwood shadows go long and blue. Clara made the decision to camp here rather than push another mile in fading light, with a wheel she didn't fully trust yet. She unhitched the horse, pulled the bedroll and the cook pack from behind the seat, turned around to find him already gathering wood from the brush along the wash, selecting pieces with a discrimination that suggested he knew fire well and had opinions about fuel. She set up the camp. He built the fire. It was a good fire. Small, tight, burning clean with almost no smoke. The kind of fire that understood it was meant to do a job, without announcing itself to everyone within 3 miles. They ate the remains of her provisions without conversation. She had hardtack and jerked beef and a small amount of dried apple that she had been rationing since Colorado. He ate what she gave him without comment and did not reach for more than she offered. When the plates were clean, he reached into his coat, which she now noticed was a heavy canvas thing, worn through at both elbows, and produced a piece of dried biscuit he had apparently been carrying on his person for some time. He broke it in half, held half out across the fire. That was the loudest thing either of them had said all day. Clara took the biscuit, ate it. It tasted like old flour and something smoky she couldn't identify, and it was one of the better things she'd eaten in 2 weeks. "Do you have a name?" she asked. He looked at her, shook his head once. "Can you speak?" "But you won't." He looked at the fire. Not an answer, but not nothing. Clara settled back on the rock she was using as a seat and let the silence be what it was. She had lived in silence long enough to know the difference between the kind that was empty and the kind that was full of things that hadn't found their shape yet. This was the second kind. She recognized it the way you recognize weather coming in from the north. Not because you can see it yet, but because the air has changed and your skin knows before your eyes do. She slept under the wagon, her usual arrangement when she was alone, which she was technically not anymore, and that thought arrived so quietly she almost missed it. The man was on the far side of the fire. She could hear his breathing, steady and low. He was not asleep. She was not sure he slept, not in the way that required unconsciousness, but at some point in the dark hours her own sleep came, and swallowed the question. She woke to a fire rebuilt and coffee she didn't have the grounds for. He had found them in a pack she hadn't opened in a week, which meant he had gone through her supplies, and she sat up with the intention of addressing that directly until she registered that he had found them, prepared them, and produced a result that smelled like the best decision anyone had made in this part of Wyoming in recent memory. So she revised her position. She touched her hair. The braid she'd put in yesterday morning had come loose during sleep, as it always did, but now it was tight again, compact and even, tied off with a strip of twine at the end. She sat with her hand on the back of her head, feeling the precise geometry of it, and then looked at him across the fire. He was whittling something. His back half turned, the big hands moving with a patience and specificity that didn't match the rest of him, or rather matched a different part of him than the part that took up space in a doorway. She didn't say anything about the braid. She accepted the coffee. On the second day, he walked ahead of the horse for a 6-mile stretch where the trail went soft and unpredictable after an unseen spring fed into the soil and the ground developed opinions about weight. He read the earth the way experienced men read it, not consciously, but continuously, his feet finding the firm patches without calculation, one hand on the horse's lead, the other hanging loose at his side. The wagon followed where he led without incident. That night he finished what he'd been whittling and held it across to her in the firelight. A wolf. Long-legged, narrow-waisted, tail arched up in the position wolves hold it when they are running. The carving was rough but not crude. There was something in the angle of the head, alert and forward-facing, that had required decision rather than habit. He pointed at her. "You think I'm a wolf?" A single nod. "No hedging, wolves get shot out here." Clara turned the carving in her hands. "Most people call them thieves." He pointed upward, at the sky, at the stars beginning to show in the purple above the cottonwood line. She followed his gesture, let it sit, then looked back at the carving, a creature that belonged to a different category than the ones the town had available. That was what he meant. She understood it without needing it explained, which was a different and stranger kind of conversation than the ones she'd been having with people who used words. She reached into the pocket where her coin pouch lived, took it out. The pouch was empty now, the ring gone, paid to a crooked sheriff in a town she intended never to return to, and the emptiness of it was something she'd been not thinking about since they left. She held it up, turned it, pulled the drawstring tight, and set it in the edge of the coals where the heat reached without the flame. "Seems like we're both unclaimed now," she said. He watched the pouch until it caught. Didn't look away from the small fire it made until there was nothing left. Then he looked at her, and the look held something she didn't have a name for yet, Something that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration, and wasn't the calculating interest that men usually directed at women alone on the road. It was steadier than all of those. Like the ground itself was watching her and had decided to pay attention. On the third morning, she found him awake before first light, sitting outside the perimeter of camp on a flat rock facing east. Just sitting. Not watchful in the way of someone expecting trouble, but watchful in the way of a man who had learned to be present to things before they happened, because the alternative had cost him too much once. She brought coffee and sat on a rock nearby. The sky was doing the long, slow thing it did out here before sunrise, going from black to a dark purple to something between gray and gold that had no good name and wasn't trying to get one. "Do you sleep?" Clara asked. He considered the question, which she appreciated, because it meant he was going to answer it honestly rather than just nodding. He shook his head. Fear? Another pause. Then a slow head shake. Guilt? His jaw moved. Not to speak, just the muscle tightening and releasing. He crouched down, picked up a stick, drew in the dry soil. 2 lines, then a cross line. A shape, a rectangle. She recognized what it was before he finished. A cage, she said. You were in one before. Not theirs. He drew a line through the shape. Gone. Clara looked at the drawing, at the lines in the dirt that described the inside of a man more clearly than most conversations described the outside of one. Maybe it's not guilt either, she said. Maybe it's just habit. Some habits stay after the reason for them is gone. He looked at her with an expression that could have meant agreement, or could have meant something else entirely. Something closer to recognition. The look of a person who has heard their own thoughts spoken aloud by a stranger. That night he retied her braid. She didn't feel it. She slept and the braid came loose as it always did, and when she surfaced briefly in the deep hours there was the sensation of hands in her hair, careful and certain, and she should have startled awake at that, should have come up fast and hostile the way she'd trained herself to react to unexpected contact after years alone. But she didn't. She stayed in the half place between sleep and waking and felt the hands work, methodical, patient, each strand placed deliberately, the twine tied at the end with a knot she hadn't taught anyone. She told herself it was fine because she was too tired to argue with herself about it. In the morning she found a small bead at the end of the braid, bone, smooth, carved with something that might have been a flower, or might have been a star. She held it between her fingers for a long time before she let it fall back against her neck and went to tend the horse. On the 4th day, they reached the approach to Red Tooth Pass, which was not actually a pass in the geological sense, but a section of trail that had been given the name by people who had survived it and wanted the achievement recognized. The canyon walls came up fast on both sides, red sandstone rearing 30 feet high, the trail narrowing until there was room for a wagon and precisely nothing else. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop at the entrance and looked at it. You've done this before, she said. Not a question. He was already out of the wagon, already at the horse's head, hand on the bridle. She handed him the reins without discussion. Trust had not arrived in a single moment. It had accumulated the way water accumulates in a low place, one small addition at a time, until there was enough to float something. He walked the horse in. She followed on the left side of the wagon, one hand on the frame, watching the cliff edge 4 feet to her, right where the ground simply stopped and became sky. The wind in the canyon came from directions she couldn't predict, cutting through gaps in the rock and arriving unexpected. The wagon was too wide for comfort and too heavy to stop quickly if something went wrong. Nothing went wrong for the first 200 yards. Then the rattlesnake. It was on the warm rock to the right of the trail, doing nothing except existing in the sun the way rattlesnakes do, until the wagon's left wheel clipped a stone, and the sudden noise sent it into the defensive coil that produced the sound, and the horse exploded. 1,200 pounds of animal lunging forward and left, the wagon lurching, the right rear wheel going toward the edge. Clara grabbing the frame with both hands and pulling back with everything she had, and it not being enough, not nearly enough. And then his hand on the bridle, one hand. The horse pulled against it and he didn't move, didn't brace, didn't plant, just stood there with his hand closed on the leather and absorbed the horse's panic through his arm and his shoulder, and the length of his body all the way to the ground. And the horse felt the immovability of him and didn't know what to do with it, because the horse had never felt anything that didn't give, and it stopped, just stopped. stood blowing and trembling and stayed where it was because the thing holding it was not a force it understood how to overcome. Clara let go of the wagon frame. Her hands were shaking. Not from the cold. He looked back at her. Not to check if she was frightened, to check if she was still standing. She was. His expression registered that fact and filed it away. They completed the pass in 23 minutes. On the other side, the canyon opened up and the sky came back, and the wind was just wind again, instead of something looking for an entry point. Clara tied the horse to a scrub juniper and sat down on a boulder and waited for her legs to remember their job. He came and sat several feet away without being invited and without staying far enough away to be polite about it. Just sat down in the middle distance and let the afternoon settle around both of them. You didn't pull, she said eventually. You just held. He looked at her. Most people pull back against a panicked horse. You just held still. He picked up a small stone, turned it in his fingers, set it down. Where did you learn that? He looked at the mountains to the west. The ones that meant Colorado or further. The ones that had produced him or eaten the person he used to be and returned something else. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of flat cedar and his knife and began to work. She watched his hands for a while, without watching them on purpose, and then she looked away at the trail ahead and thought about Thomas, who had also had a way of answering questions with his hands, who had built things when he didn't know how to say things, who had framed the doorway of their first house with a precision that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with wanting her to walk through something beautiful every morning. The knife kept moving. The cedar took shape. When he handed it to her that evening, it was two figures, both seated, both facing the same direction. The carving was not finished, and she didn't think it was meant to be. She turned it in her hands and looked at the two rough shapes, with their suggestion of shared direction and their deliberate proximity, and she put it in her coat pocket without saying anything. He watched her pocket it. Then he looked back at the fire. She had been traveling alone for so long that alone had stopped feeling like a condition and had started feeling like a feature of reality, like weather or gravity, something that was simply the case and did not require examination. And now she was sitting across a fire from a man who did not speak and had braided her hair without permission and had carved her into a piece of wood alongside a version of himself. And she was trying to remember when she'd decided this was acceptable. She couldn't find the moment. That was the strangest part. There was no moment, just the accumulation. I'm not looking for a husband, she said. He didn't react, or a hand, or a story to collect. She looked at him across the fire. I bought you because you didn't deserve that cage. Not because I need anything from you. He met her eyes, held them. Then he reached deliberately into his coat and produced something wrapped in oilcloth, small enough to fit in his palm. He unfolded the cloth and held the contents across to her. A single bead, not bone this time. Glass, or something that had the quality of glass without being transparent, a dark amber that caught the firelight and held it, carved into its surface, very small, almost requiring assumption rather than sight, a flame. She looked at the bead, at his hand holding it, at the steadiness with which he waited. For what, she didn't know. Permission, maybe? Or just the acknowledgement that something was being given rather than simply placed. She held out her braid, the end of it with the first bone bead still tied there. He tied the second bead beside it, his fingers working through the strands with the same methodical care she'd felt in the dark hours, each movement unhurried. The knot done 3 times, because the first 2 weren't tight enough to suit him. When he was done, he sat back. She let the braid fall against her shoulder and touched the 2 beads where they rested together, bone and amber, the beginning of something whose shape she couldn't see yet. Did you ever belong to anyone? She asked. He pressed a hand to his chest, his palm flat over the place where his heart was doing whatever it did these days. Then he moved his head slowly, not quite a shake, more like a long and considered no that had taken a long time to arrive at. Maybe that's for the best, Clara said. People who've belonged to someone have to carry what they lost. He looked at her, with an expression that said he knew something about that, which she had suspected, and that he was considering whether to say so, which was the first time she'd seen him consider anything approaching speech. He didn't speak. But that night, when she woke at 2 a.m, with the fire burned down to coals and the Wyoming stars doing their cold and indifferent brilliant thing overhead, she reached back and found the braid tight against her neck. the beads in their place, and at the very end, wrapped around the tie string, a thin strip of cedar bark with something scratched into it. She tilted it toward the dim red of the coals. 2 figures, side by side. She put the bark strip into her coat pocket with the carving, lay back down, looked at the stars through the gap in the cottonwood branches above her. From the other side of the fire, breathing slow and steady and not quite asleep, and sometime in the hour before dawn, when everything was quiet in the way that's different from silence. Because silence is what remains when sound leaves, and this was what exists before sound arrives. She thought about the ring she'd given to a crooked sheriff in a town she'd never returned to, and about the 17 years it had spent on her finger, and about the fact that she didn't miss it the way she'd expected to. She missed Thomas. She would always miss Thomas. But the ring had been a symbol of something that was already finished, and finished things don't need to be carried unless you make them into weights. She had carried it long enough, and somewhere between Caldwell Crossing and this unnamed wash in the dark of Wyoming, the weight had been transferred into something she couldn't name yet, something with 2 beads and a strip of cedar bark, something still being carved, in the wagon bed behind her, in the dark that covered them both equally, and without preference. The oilcloth was wrapped around one thing she knew about, and one thing she didn't. The thing she didn't know about was a piece of paper, folded 4 times, with Thomas Reed's signature on it and Rex Dolan's stamp below, and a date that was 3 years past the date of her husband's death, and a figure written in ink that said $400, and a claim against the land at Harrow Creek. She slept, he stayed awake. He always stayed awake, not from fear, not from guilt, from the habit of watching, the habit built over years of living in places where what you didn't see coming arrived faster than what you did, and the cost of being wrong once had been high enough that he had never been willing to pay it again. He sat on the far side of the fire's remains and watched the perimeter of the camp and thought about the paper in his coat and the woman asleep under the wagon and the way she had held out her braid without asking what for. He thought about Caldwell Crossing and the cage and the sheriff's face when she'd held up the ring. He thought about Harrow Creek. He thought about Rex Dolan, who was not the kind of man who let a problem walk away on a wagon with a repaired wheel. Who was, in fact, the kind of man who let a problem walk away and then followed it at a distance until the problem arrived somewhere useful. He pulled out the paper, looked at it in the quarter light of the dying fire, put it back, looked at the road east, waited for morning. The 5th morning came in flat and gray, the kind of sky that had made a decision about itself overnight and wasn't interested in discussion. Clara woke to a rebuilt fire, which meant Cole had not slept, which was no longer a surprise but remained a fact she carried with her, the way you carry information about weather, not because you can change it, but because it affects every other calculation you make. He was at the perimeter of camp when she rose, not pacing, standing with the absolute stillness of something structural, a post, a stone, a thing placed with intention and not inclined to renegotiate its position, facing north. The grass there ran flat and pale to the horizon, and there was nothing to look at, and he was looking at all of it. She made coffee, brought him a cup without asking. He took it without looking away from the north. "You expecting something?" Clara asked. A pause long enough to mean the question was being considered rather than deflected. Then a slow shake of his head. "Then what are you watching for?" He looked at his coffee, at the steam rising from it in the cold morning air. Then he set the cup down on a flat rock beside him, crouched, and picked up a stone from the ground, turned it in his fingers, set it back exactly where he'd found it. She understood. He didn't know what he was watching for. The watching had outlasted whatever had originally required it. The habit of vigilance is the last thing a man puts down after loss, sometimes the only thing, because as long as you're watching, you're still doing something, and doing something is the only available argument against the fact of what's already gone. Thomas used to sit at the window after his first year of enlistment, Clara said. Before Shiloh, on leave. He'd sit there in the evening looking out at the road, and I'd ask what he was watching for, and he'd say nothing, just watching. She looked at the north horizon where Cole's attention lived. I thought it was fear then. Later I understood it was just the shape a man's mind takes when he's been responsible for things that can't be undone. Some shapes don't go back. Cole picked up his coffee, drank it while it was still hot, and came back to the fire. That was enough. That was its own kind of conversation. They broke camp in 30 minutes and put the trail behind them at a pace the horse set without being pushed. The country changed through the morning. The open Wyoming grassland beginning to complicate itself with draws and rocky outcroppings. The land developing opinions about topography the way land does, when mountains are close enough to have influence. The mountains were visible now as facts rather than suggestions, blue and definite against the western sky. And Clara watched them from the wagon bench with the feeling of someone approaching a thing that has been theoretical for a long time and is about to become real. Around midday, the trail narrowed and the rock walls came up fast. Red Tooth Pass, named by people who had survived it and wanted the achievement acknowledged. The canyon cut through a section of red sandstone that had been splitting along its own grain for 10,000 years and hadn't finished yet, and the trail through it was wide enough for a wagon and the strict minimum of additional circumstances. Cole was out of the wagon before she'd fully stopped it. At the horse's head, hand on the bridle, reading the approach the way he read all terrain. Not with his eyes exactly, but with some faculty that processed the ground, before conscious thought arrived to organize it. She gave him the reins without discussion. He walked the horse in. She walked the left side, one hand on the wagon frame, 3 feet of clear air between her right boot and the canyon edge, where the ground made its opinion about gravity permanently clear. The sound in the canyon was different from outside it. The horse's hooves on stone and the wagon's creak bouncing off the walls and returning slightly changed, and her own breathing, which she monitored the way. She monitored anything she couldn't afford to lose control of. Cole moved at the pace the terrain required, slower on the tilted sections. His free hand swung loose at his side, and she watched it register information as he walked, touching the wall briefly at one point, adjusting the angle of the horse's path without visible instruction. The movements of a man who had been reading landscapes since before he knew that was what he was doing. 400 yards in, on a blind curve where the wall turned and the light changed, a rock dove exploded from a crevice 3 feet above the horse's head. The horse shied hard left, directly toward the canyon wall, and Cole moved with it rather than against it, a single step that put him between the horse and the wall, absorbing the animal's lateral panic with his body the way a breakwater absorbs a wave, not stopping it but redirecting it. His shoulder hit the rock face. He didn't make a sound. The horse blew hard and steadied. Clara had not let go of the wagon frame. Her knuckles were white and she didn't care. Cole looked back at her, not to ask if she was frightened, to confirm she was upright. She was. He turned back to the horse and they continued. On the other side, the canyon opened into afternoon light, and the sky came back and the wind was just wind again. And Clara sat down on a boulder beside the trail and put her hands on her knees and breathed the way you breathe after something is over that you were not certain would be over. Cole brought the horse to a stop. Didn't comment on the sitting, didn't stand over her. He went to the horse's left shoulder, the one that had taken the brunt of the shying, and ran his hands down the leg with the focused attention of someone checking for damage he'd rather find now than later. Ridgeton, Clara said, when her legs had remembered themselves. 12 miles, salt and oats. He nodded. They went. Ridgeton was large enough to have a hotel sign painted within the last decade, and a general store with real glass in the window, and enough foot traffic on market day that 2 strangers arriving on a wagon were absorbed rather than announced. Clara went into the store. Salt, oats, coffee, a small jar of honey she bought without justifying it. Because there are things a person can survive without, and things that make surviving everything else feel like a choice rather than a sentence. Cole stayed with the horse at the rail outside. She was paying when she noticed the clerk had looked past her shoulder for the 3rd time. She knew what he was looking at. Cole at a hitching rail was not something the eye processed once and filed away. He was something the eye returned to, in the same way the eye returns to something it's trying to categorize and hasn't managed yet. The horse beside him looked smaller than it had before they'd arrived in town, which was a quality of proximity she'd noticed before, and had stopped remarking on internally because it simply was. She took her packages outside. They were 4 steps from the wagon when the men came from the south end of the street. 2 of them trail dusty, moving with the destination-specific purpose of men who had been sent somewhere and had found it. The one in front tracked onto Cole with his eyes before he'd fully stopped walking. Recognition, not friendly. "You're the man from Dolan's fence line." Flat, informational. confirming an address. Cole stood at the rail and let them arrive into his field of vision without repositioning himself to accommodate them. He didn't square up, didn't shift his weight, just stood there the way a wall stands there, which is to say without apology and without invitation. The second man was recalculating Clara, deciding she wasn't decorative. She put her packages in the wagon bed and stepped between Cole and the two men, not because she thought her physical presence was a deterrent. She weighed what she weighed and stood as tall as she stood, and neither figure made her a barrier in any practical sense. She stepped between them because some statements have to be made by a specific person, and this one was hers to make. This man is with me. The voice that had argued a land deed in a county clerk's office and won. You want trouble, you'll find it, but not here and not today. The first man looked at her, then passed her at Cole, who had not moved but whose not moving had taken on a quality that was distinct from ordinary stillness. The stillness of a very large thing that has decided what it will do if the situation requires it and is simply waiting to see if the situation will. The two men looked at each other. They left, not running, deliberately not running. But they left and they didn't look back, which told Clara more than the leaving did. She turned around. Cole was looking at her with an expression she'd seen once before. In the canyon the previous afternoon after the rock dove, the moment of confirmation that she was still standing. He looked at her that way now, but longer. Like the fact of her standing between him and two armed men was information he was still processing and hadn't finished with. The words came out of him, like something that had been stored somewhere that didn't get much use, rougher in the throat than a voice should be, the sound of a mechanism recalling its function. You didn't need to do that. Clara went very still on the inside. On the outside she didn't move at all, because she understood immediately that this was not the same as the nods and the shakes and the gestures. This was a sentence. Subject, verb, object, the complete machinery of language deployed without warning after days of silence. And the fact of it in the air between them was enormous, in a way she was careful not to make enormous, because if she made it enormous, he would retreat from it. Yes, I did, she said, simply, and turned back to the wagon. She was untying the reins when the woman appeared beside her. 60 or thereabouts, hat with a fresh ribbon, eyes the color of good creek water. Is he yours? Clara didn't pause. No, but I'm his. The woman's face did something that wasn't quite a smile but came from the same place smiles come from. That's rarer than gold out here. She touched her hat brim and moved off down the boardwalk, unhurried, and Clara watched her go with the feeling that the woman had already decided something and acted on it and would not be looking back either. They drove out of Ridgeton in silence. Half a mile past the town limit, Clara said. Without looking back, they work for Dolan. A sound from the wagon bed. A scent. He knows I'm heading to Harrow Creek. Not a question. She was mapping it as she spoke. He sent them to confirm it was me and then report back. From behind her, one word, yes. She kept her eyes on the trail and let the word sit. 2 sentences in one afternoon. Which was not nothing. Which was in fact the opposite of nothing, but which she was going to treat as ordinary. Because treating it as ordinary was the only way to let it become ordinary, and ordinary was what he needed it to be before he could do it again. They camped in a hollow where the creek bent and the bank cut the wind. Clara made a proper meal because they had proper provisions now, and she built the fire herself while Cole walked the perimeter once, and then came back and sat across from her with his knife out, not carving yet, just holding it the way some men hold things when thinking. Requires the hands to be occupied so the mind can go where it needs to go. The meal was finished and the fire had settled from flame to serious coal before she asked, "What happened to your voice?" He looked at the fire. His jaw moved, that tight release she'd catalogued by now as the thing his body did when a question had reached something real. He reached for a flat piece of bark beside the fire, not the ground this time. He picked up the bark, held it angled toward the firelight, and began working into its surface with the tip of his knife. Slow, deliberate, not drawing, carving, each mark cut into the material rather than traced over it, the way a man chooses to make something permanent rather than something that will be gone when the wind comes. A rectangle, lines inside it suggesting walls. Then, outside the rectangle, a mark like a standing figure. Then a second mark, fire inside the rectangle. The sequence read itself a cabin, a man outside it, then fire inside it, and the man too far away to reach the door in time. You were outside when it started, Clara said. He cut one more mark. A line between the figure and the rectangle, with a gap in the middle. You tried to get back in and couldn't, his knife stilled. He turned the piece of bark in his hands and looked at what was on it. Then he set it down on a stone at the edge of the fire ring and left it there, face up, the way you leave something, when you're done carrying it, but not ready to lose sight of it entirely. What was her name? Clara asked, quiet. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Ruth, low, 2 letters and then silence, but complete, a full word, chosen, offered. Clara sat with the name the way you sit with something handed to you that you understand is valuable. Ruth, she said back, not as repetition but as acknowledgement. Confirmation that she had received it. I couldn't say Thomas's name for almost 2 years after Shiloh, she said. Someone would say it in conversation and I'd find a reason to leave the room. Not because I didn't want to hear it. Because it had too much of him inside it. Like the name was the last place he was still living and saying it out loud used it up. She looked at the bark carving on the stone. Grief does something to language. Makes some words too heavy to lift for a while. Cole looked at her. Not past her. Not at something near her. At her, with the full specific attention of a man who had been watching things from a distance for so long that being looked at directly was its own kind of disorientation. And he was choosing to stay in it rather than look away. He reached into his coat. His hand came out holding something small wrapped in a strip of leather. He unwound the leather slowly, the way you unwrap something you've been careful with, and held out what was inside. A ring, plain, dented on one side, the metal darkened with years. Not gold, something harder and simpler than gold. She looked at it in his palm. She gave it to you, Clara said. A nod. And you've been carrying it since the fire. Another nod. His hand didn't waver. You want me to carry it now? He held it steady and looked at her, and the look was not a request. It was the offering of something that had been in his possession for long enough to have changed what his possession meant, and he was choosing to change that, to put it somewhere else. Somewhere that was moving forward rather than standing still in 1878 Colorado, with the smell of smoke and the specific sound of a door that wouldn't open. Clara reached out and took the ring, closed her fingers around it. The metal was warm from his coat and his hand and all the years between. I'll carry it, she said, and I'll carry you with it. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to identify, because it belonged to him, and naming it would have been a kind of trespass. She held the ring and let the fire do what fires do, and the night settled around both of them with the sounds it made when it was simply being itself without an audience. She did not sleep for a long time, not from worry, from the fullness of the day, which had contained more than days usually do. The canyon, the pass, the men on the street, the sentence in the air, the ring in her hand, and the name in the air, and the carved bark on the stone, and the particular quality of being looked at by someone who has been looking away for a long time, and has decided to stop. She lay on her back under the wagon and looked at the gap in the canvas above her, and thought about Thomas, who had also had a language of objects, who had built things when he couldn't say things, who had left a land deed and a pencil-marked map as his final sentence to her, and had trusted her to read it. She had read it. She was reading it still, 20 years later, crossing Wyoming on a wagon with a cracked wheel that had been repaired twice, and a braid that had accumulated the history of the last 9 days in 4 beads and a strip of bark. Thomas had loved her with words, abundantly, easily, in the way of a man for whom language was never the problem. Cole loved with his hands and his attention, and a ring he had stopped being able to carry alone. She was not comparing them. She was recognizing that love takes the shape of the person doing it, and both shapes had been real, and neither one cancelled the other, and she was large enough to hold both. She closed her eyes with Ruth's ring in her fist. In the morning she found a bead tied at the end of her braid. She hadn't felt him at it, but she had slept eventually, and he had apparently found that sufficient opportunity. This bead was different from the others. Dark amber, small, with a mark carved into it that she had to tilt toward the dawn light to read. 2 parallel lines, going the same direction. She touched it once, let it fall against her neck with the others, said nothing about it, and he said nothing about it, and they broke camp and ate and got moving, which was also a kind of saying something. 2 days from Harrow Creek, on an afternoon when the light had gone, the particular gold of late Wyoming summer, and the mountains had moved from the distance into the middle ground, Cole reached into his coat for the 4th time and produced the paper. He held it across the wagon bench to her. She took it. She had known something was coming, had felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Something in the way he'd been carrying himself since Caldwell Crossing, a quality of waiting in him, not evasion but patience. The patience of a man who has been holding something until the right moment because he understands that the right moment matters and will know it when it comes. She unfolded it. Read it again. The land at Harrow Creek. Thomas's signature. Recognizable. The careful angular handwriting she'd last seen on a Sunday afternoon in Missouri, when he'd drawn maps in pencil and named waypoints with the confidence of a man who believed he would live to see them. Below the signature, $400. Below that, a date, August 1865. Thomas had died in April 1862. Clara refolded the paper along its original creases, took her time with it. When her hands were steady, she looked at Cole. Where did you get this? He pointed south and west, back toward Caldwell Crossing, toward the territory where Dolan's fence lines ran. You found it on his land. She was building it as she spoke, the structure of it assembling itself from available parts. Before they put you in the cage, you were carrying it when they caught you near his fence. A nod. Slow, with the weight of everything that had followed from that single fact. She turned to look at him fully. You knew this existed before you ever saw me. He held her gaze. Did not look away from the thing he was confirming, and you waited. She said it without accusation. She was understanding rather than accusing, mapping the geography of a decision. You waited until you knew what I was walking into. He looked at the paper in her hands, then at her face. He reached into his coat one more time and produced the carved piece of bark from the night by the fire, the one he'd left on the stone, and which he had apparently carried since. He held it up beside the paper. The two things side by side, the evidence of what had been done to her, and the evidence of what had been done to him. One document, one piece of bark, both carried, both brought to this moment. She understood. He had not hidden the paper from her. He had been waiting until she knew enough of him to receive it with the full context of who had found it and where and at what cost. Trust given too early is just information. Trust given at the right moment is a decision. Dolan's been waiting for me to arrive, Clara said. He has a forged claim on Thomas's land and he needs me present to enforce it. She looked at the road ahead, at the country between here and the Montana line. And he knows I'm coming because his men saw us in Ridgeton. Cole set the piece of bark down on the bench between them. She picked it up, held it alongside the paper. Evidence and history compact enough to fit in two hands. We'd better get there first, she said. And we'd better get there with everything we have. He took the reins from her hands. She let him, the same way she'd let him take the canyon. Not from helplessness, but from the understanding that some things work better when you stop trying to manage them alone. She sat beside him on the bench instead of behind him in the wagon, which was a small change and not a small change. And they covered the last miles before camp side by side with the mountains ahead of them and the gold light going out of the sky. The creek that night was the sound of the whole journey, running somewhere below the camp in the dark, moving at the pace of water, which is to say without stopping, which is to say in the direction of where it needs to be. Clara sat outside after the fire had gone to coals and held Ruth's ring in one hand and the folded paper in the other, and thought about the distance between what things are and what they mean, which is usually the distance between an object and the life it has been part of. The ring was a ring. It was also everything that had ended in a fire in Colorado, and everything that had been carried since, and everything that was being handed forward into whatever came next. The paper was a document. It was also a crime and a plan, and the specific shape of what one man would do to another man's wife over $400 and 400 acres. She put the ring in her coat pocket, close to where her original deed lived, the two things together. What was true and what was offered as testimony to something true. Cole came back from the perimeter and sat at the edge of the dead fire, not across from her, beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold night air, the substantial fact of him present and undemanding. Tomorrow, Clara said. A nod. Are you ready? He looked at the mountains, dark now, visible only as the place where the stars stopped. Then he looked at her. And what was in his face was not readiness in the performative sense. Not the readiness of someone who has talked himself into something. It was the readiness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the moment to confirm it. He reached into his coat, produced the flat stone from the first morning at Harrow Creek's boundary, the one he hadn't let her hand back, the one with his name cut into it, set it on the ground between them. Cole. Then he reached over and found the end of her braid. She felt the 5th bead before she knew he was adding it. He worked it in below the 4th, at the very end of the plait, and knotted it with the same deliberate tightness he brought to everything his hands made. When he was done, she reached back and felt it. Stone, river stone, small and smooth, the kind of thing a creek produces over decades of patient work. She brought the braid forward over her shoulder and looked at the 5 beads in the last dim light. Bone amber, brass ring, dark wood, parallel lines, river stone. She looked at him. He pressed his palm flat against his chest, then moved it to the stone on the ground between them, then gestured forward, toward the north, toward Montana, toward the valley neither of them had stood in yet, but which both of them were already carrying. The stone means we're going there together, she understood. Not that we've arrived, that we're going. Yes, she said, we are. The mountains held the dark. The creek ran in the dark below them, and 2 people who had both lost the specific gravity of being known sat beside a dead fire on the last night before Harrow Creek, with 5 beads between them and a forged document and a dead woman's ring and a dead man's dream, and none of it was simple and all of it was real, and the realness of it was enough, and would be enough, and they both knew it without saying so, because by now they both knew which things required saying, and which things were already said. Harrow Creek announced itself not with a sign but with water, the sound of it first, a low continuous presence under the wind, and then the creek itself appearing through a gap in the ridgeline, cold and clear and running without apology over a bed of pale stone. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop on the high ground and looked down at the valley that Thomas Reed had described in pencil on a Sunday afternoon 20 years ago, and had never seen with his own eyes. 400 acres, more or less. The grass was long from a winter without anyone to manage it, bending in the April wind in slow waves that moved from west to east like something breathing. The creek curved through the lower third of the property in a wide arc, deep enough in the center to reflect sky. At the far end of the curve, set back from the water on a slight rise, the cabin. 2 walls standing fully. A third half collapsed, the logs splayed outward from a corner joint that had given up negotiating with gravity. The 4th wall was gone entirely, replaced by a tangle of old vine and volunteer willow that had moved in and made permanent arrangements. The roof was a suggestion. The chimney was the most intact structure on the property, standing straight and complete, which said something about what stone could outlast that timber couldn't. Cole stood beside the wagon and looked at all of it with the unhurried assessment of a man who had built things and lost things and built things again and understood exactly what each category required. Clara climbed down, walked to the edge of the high ground. The wind came up the slope and took the front of her coat and she let it. 20 years. Thomas had paid for this land with his enlistment bonus, sent the money ahead with a letter that said, "When the war is done, we will go west, and I will build you something permanent." And then the war had not been done for him, and the permanence had been arranged differently than either of them had planned. And here she was at the edge of it with a braid full of beads and a dead woman's ring in her pocket and a man behind her who took up most of the sky. This was supposed to be Thomas's, she said. Now I think it's ours, if you want it. Cole walked past her, down the slope. He moved through the long grass without disturbing it any more than necessary, which was a quality she'd stopped remarking on. The way he occupied space without wasting it. At the base of the slope he crouched beside the creek, pressed both palms flat to the bank, stayed there for a moment feeling whatever the ground was saying, stood, walked to the cabin, ducked his head through the doorless entry, looked at the 2 standing walls with the eye of someone taking measurements that had nothing to do with numbers. He came back up the slope, crouched beside her, picked up a flat stone, drew his knife. She watched one letter appear, then another, then another, then another. Cole. He placed the stone in her hand. She held it, turned it, set it back in his palm and closed his fingers around it. Not yet, she said. Keep it until we've earned it. He looked at her, then pocketed the stone. They heard the horses before they saw them. 4 sets of hooves, coming from the east along the creek trail, and then Rex Dolan cresting the low rise at the property's boundary with the timing of a man who had been watching from a distance and had chosen his moment with care. He was wearing the sheepskin vest again. The cigar was lit this time, a thin trail of smoke rising from the corner of his mouth into the clear Montana air. 3 men behind him, not the same 2 from Ridgeton, different, bigger, the kind of men who were hired not for their conversation. And beside Dolan, slightly behind and slightly to the left, Sheriff Harker from Caldwell Crossing, who had no jurisdiction in Montana and knew it and had come anyway, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what kind of arrangement existed between these 2 men and how long it had existed. Dolan pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from the wagon, looked at the property with an expression of proprietary familiarity, the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him and is now simply going through the ritual of taking possession. Mrs. Reed. The cigar moved when he spoke. You made good time. Clara stood at the wagon. Cole stood 6 feet to her left, which meant he was standing in the center of Dolan's line of sight, which was a position he'd arrived at without appearing to choose it. Mr. Dolan. No more warmth in her voice than the April creek. Dolan reached into his vest pocket. The document emerged folded, crisp at the edges, the way documents are crisp when they've been prepared carefully and kept flat and haven't been carried across 8 days of trail in the coat pocket of a woman who'd slept in a wagon bed. He held it out, though he made no move to bring his horse closer. Your late husband owed me $400. Signed and witnessed. This property covers the debt and the interest. Clara didn't take the document from 20 feet away, didn't move toward it. Show me the signature date. A pause. Dolan opened the document himself, held it face out. She couldn't read it at this distance, and he knew that, and he knew she knew that, and the performance of showing it was exactly that, performance. Because the point wasn't the document's contents, but the document's existence. What date? She asked. August 1865. Thomas Reed died at Shiloh in April of 1862, a beat. Dolan drew on his cigar, let the smoke go slowly. Records from the war are incomplete, dates get confused, by 3 years. These things happen. Clara reached into her coat. The original deed, Thomas's, registered in Billings in 1879 by a notary named William Stark, whose stamp was as clear as the day he'd pressed it into the paper. She held it up. She didn't say anything. The document said everything that needed to be said, and it said it in the particular language of legal paper and notary stamps that was the only language Dolan actually respected. Dolan looked at it. His expression didn't change, which meant it changed enormously, because men like Dolan have spent decades learning to keep their faces still when what's underneath them is moving fast in a bad direction. Dates can be misread, he said. That's for a court to determine. The notary's stamp is dated March 1879, Clara said. Your document's signature is August 1865. A court will determine that my dead husband signed your document 14 years before this deed was registered, at a time when he had been dead for 3 years, which will raise questions about who actually held this pen. The man directly behind Dolan moved his hand toward his hip. Not all the way, just toward. Cole took 1 step forward, 1 step, that was all. The man's hand stopped, because Cole had moved from standing 6 feet to Clara's left to standing 4 feet closer to Dolan's men, and the geometry of it had shifted every calculation in the conversation. He hadn't reached for anything. He hadn't changed his expression. He had simply redistributed his mass in space. And the redistribution alone altered the arithmetic of the situation in ways that rendered a sidearm less relevant than it had been 3 seconds ago. Dolan looked at Cole. Cole looked at Dolan. Harker, who had not dismounted and whose horse was standing at an angle that suggested even the horse was reconsidering its options, looked at both of them and then looked at something in the middle distance that was easier to look at. That's a very large man you're traveling with, Dolan said conversationally. He's quiet, Clara said, but he has excellent instincts. The sound came from the west. Horses again, but different, the unhurried pace of animals that weren't being pushed because they didn't need to be. Clara didn't look away from Dolan, but she heard them come up the slope and stop behind her and to her right. She heard a man clear his throat. Rex Dolan. The voice was dry and measured. The voice of someone who had spent considerable time in rooms where what you said and how you said it had consequences, and had learned to calibrate accordingly. I've been expecting to run into you somewhere. She turned. 3 riders. The 2 in back were younger, sitting straight in the saddle with the alert quiet of men who were waiting for instructions. The man in front was 60 or thereabouts, iron-haired, wearing a coat that had been good once and was still serviceable, with the particular bearing of someone who had held authority for so long that it had stopped being a thing he performed and had become simply the way he moved through space. Judge Emmett Coles, former Circuit Court of Denver, retired to Harrow Creek 3 years ago, which Clara did not know yet. What she knew was that he had the kind of face that had heard everything and been surprised by very little of it and had developed, as a result, a patience that was less virtue than accumulated experience. Henderson family, he said, still looking at Dolan. 1879. They lost their property in Gallatin County on a debt claim dated 2 years before Henderson arrived in Montana. Morrison family, 1880. Debt claim dated before Morrison's land was surveyed. And now Reed, he nodded at Clara. Third forged deed I've seen with your name on it, Dolan. Dolan's cigar had gone still at the corner of his mouth. You've got no jurisdiction out here. I'm a private citizen, Judge Cole said pleasantly. I'm not exercising jurisdiction. I'm having a conversation. He looked at Harker Sheriff. You're a long way from Caldwell Crossing. Harker's horse shifted. Harker shifted with it, just accompanying Mr. Dolan on a business matter. The judge's eyes moved back to Dolan. The business matter being the acquisition of land belonging to a widow through a document bearing a dead man's signature at a date 3 years after his documented death. I imagine the territorial court in Billings would find that interesting. Grace Fuller had done this. Clara understood it in the moment the judge spoke, assembled it from available pieces. The woman in the hat at Ridgeton, the Creekwater eyes, the assessment that was too complete to be casual, the fact that she had moved off down the boardwalk, without looking back, because she'd already seen what she needed to see and had somewhere to be, the wife of a court recorder, or a judge's acquaintance, or simply a woman who knew what a forged deed looked like, because she'd seen what happened to families when they were used, and who had put a rider on the Billings Road that evening. Dolan took the cigar from his mouth, looked at it, put it back. He looked at Clara, at the original deed in her hand, at Cole, who had not moved from his redistributed position, but who had a quality of stillness now that was different from his ordinary stillness, the way a river looks different when it's about to narrow. He looked at his 3 men. His 3 men looked at Cole. This isn't finished, Dolan said, not loud. The kind of statement a man makes when he's withdrawing from a position and wants to be understood as doing it tactically rather than completely. Clara met his eyes. It is for today, she said. And tomorrow we'll still have the deed and you'll still have a dead man's signature on a document a judge has personally witnessed. Do the arithmetic, Mr. Dolan. Dolan turned his horse. The 3 men turned their horses. Harker was already turning his. They went back the way they'd come, east along the creek trail, and the sound of them diminished into the ordinary sounds of the valley. Coles watched them go. He'll file a challenge in Billings, he said. It'll fail. I'll write a letter to Judge Harker tonight. He and I were in the same court for 11 years. He looked at Clara directly for the first time. Your husband's deed is registered and witnessed. The forgery is obvious to anyone who checks the dates. It won't hold. Clara held out her hand. He shook it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He glanced at the cabin on the rise. You've got considerable work ahead of you. He and his 2 riders went back over the western rise, and Clara stood on the high ground above Harrow Creek with the deed in her hand and the afternoon light going long and gold across 400 acres of Montana grass, and felt the full weight of where she was and how she'd arrived here, and what it had cost and what it had returned. Cole was looking at the cabin. It's worse than I thought, she said. He turned to her with an expression that translated approximately as, good. She looked at him. You actually want a project that large? He picked up the stone from his pocket, the one with his name carved in it, held it up. She took it this time. They worked the first week without stopping for anything except sleep and food, and the kind of necessary pause that large physical labor demands before the body starts deducting from reserves it can't replenish. Cole's approach to the cabin was methodical and unhurried and total. He assessed each timber before touching it, working from the standing walls outward, understanding the structure's remaining logic before introducing any new logic of his own. The collapsed corner came down first, completely, because you cannot build on a compromised foundation regardless of how much of it appears to be intact. Clara cleared brush, dug out the vine from fourth wall's remains, found that the stone foundation beneath the willow was sound, which mattered, because sound foundations are the rarest inheritance a ruined thing can offer. They ate at the end of each day's light, sitting outside, on what had been the cabin's threshold, and was now just the edge between inside and out. She cooked. He ate. The conversation was the kind that accumulated in silences, rather than words, the running commentary of two people doing work in the same space, who have reached the point where narrating the work would be redundant because the work itself is the communication. On the fourth day, he rebuilt the fourth wall. She watched him lift the first log into position, 12 feet of green-cut timber that weighed what it weighed, which was considerably more than any reasonable definition of one person's load. He lifted it alone, positioned it alone, braced it with one hand while driving the corner pin with the other, and she sat on the foundation stones and watched this the way you watch weather or rivers. Not because watching is useful, but because looking away would be a failure of witness. By the second week the roof was framed. By the third it was sealed. The cabin was small, 2 rooms and a loft he'd added without discussing it, simply adding it because the structure wanted a loft the way a sentence wants a period. When she asked about it he pointed upward, then pantomimed looking out over a distance. "You want to see what's coming," she said. He shook his head, then pointed at her and then at the loft. "You want me to be able to see what's coming?" He nodded. Once. The way he nodded, everything important. She built the porch railing herself because there was something she needed her hands to do, and railing was something her hands already knew. Thomas had taught her. Years ago, the summer before he enlisted, both of them on their knees in Missouri, with tools that were slightly too large for the job and the confidence that comes from not yet knowing how much you don't know. She'd built 3 porches since then, and this one went up clean and even, and she was satisfied with it in the way you're satisfied with something you've made that will outlast the making. Cole watched her finish it, ran his hand along the top rail, nodded. She understood by now that this was the full measure of his approval, and it was not insufficient. On the morning she found the small, cracked mirror at the bottom of the travel chest. She stood at the wash basin and looked at herself for the first time since Caldwell Crossing, not quickly. She looked the way you look at something you've been avoiding to confirm that what you were afraid of finding is actually what's there. The hair was longer. The braid, which Cole had maintained with regularity she'd stopped tracking, hung to the middle of her back now. 4 beads, bone, amber, brass, dark wood, each one in its place. Each one a marker of something that had happened on the road between Missouri and Montana. She touched them one by one and then let the braid fall and looked at her face in the cracked glass. Not old, not young. The face of someone who had been through something and come out the other side, without losing the essential feature of themselves, which was hard to name but was something in the eyes, a quality of being present that she recognized as her own and was glad to see still there. She thought about the ring in her pocket. Ruth's ring. She took it out and held it in the morning light and thought about a woman who had loved a man large enough to fill a doorframe and who had died in a fire before she'd had the chance to see what that love would become. And she thought about what it meant to carry someone else's ended thing, not as weight, as witness. The way you carry a candle not because you lit it, but because someone handed it to you in the dark and the darkness was the reason to keep it burning. She put the ring back in her pocket. Clara was on the porch with coffee when Cole came back from the tree line in the late afternoon carrying a brace of rabbits and a branch of pine that he didn't appear to have a purpose for, and which he proceeded to whittle into a purpose over the course of the evening without explaining what it would be. She had stopped asking. Whatever it was, it would be something specific and intentional and would be handed to her when it was finished, and she would understand what it meant. And understanding it would tell her something about the interior landscape of a man who spoke in objects more fluently than in sentences. Summer came without announcement. The grass grew, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from the mountains. And the garden she'd planted in the south-facing ground below the cabin started to produce evidence that it intended to become an actual garden rather than an aspirational one. Cole built the fence around it in a single day, measuring nothing. Cutting by eye, every post level by whatever internal instrument he was consulting that had nothing to do with tools. They were not a married couple. The word for what they were as exist somewhere in the space between traveling companions and something that had no established vocabulary in 1882 Montana, which she'd decided was fine, because the space itself was real and sufficient regardless of what it was called. He braided her hair. She made his coffee strong enough to qualify as a structural material. He checked the wagon wheels weekly. She kept the fire built to the specific temperature that produced the kind of heat he used for his woodwork. These were the facts of their arrangement, and the facts of an arrangement are the arrangement, whatever you call it. On the evening of the last long day of July, when the lights stayed until nearly 9 o'clock, and the grass had gone from green to gold, and back to a particular shade of late summer green that only existed in this specific valley at this specific hour, Clara sat on the porch and watched Cole in the yard. He was chopping wood. The autumn supply, building the pile that would carry them through whatever Montana's winter intended, which was in her understanding considerable. The axe in his hand looked proportional to him the way nothing else ever quite did, built for someone of his size by someone who had known someone of his size, and each stroke was clean and complete, the log splitting down the grain, without resistance, because he never went against the grain, which she had decided was one of the fundamental truths about how he operated in every medium he worked in. She put her hand on her abdomen. The way you put your hand on something when you already know what it is but haven't said it yet, because saying it changes its nature, makes it a thing in the world rather than a thing in yourself. And you need a moment more of it being only yours. She had known for 2 weeks. Had been certain for one. Had been waiting for the right moment for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, except that the right moment had a quality you recognized, and this wasn't quite it yet. Cole looked up. He looked up the way he always did, the comprehensive scan of the perimeter, and then his gaze came to the porch and stopped. She didn't know what her face was doing. She never quite knew what her face was doing when she wasn't managing it, which she wasn't, which meant he was reading whatever was actually there. He put the axe down. He crossed the yard in the long stride way he covered distance, when he wasn't moderating his pace for the benefit of people shorter than him. Up the porch steps, the planks absorbing his weight with the same reliable creak they always made. He sat beside her. Not on the other chair. On the step at her level, shoulders almost touching. She took his hand, put it where her hand had been. Neither of them spoke. The axe stood upright in the yard where he'd left it. The wood pile was half built. The creek ran its commentary at the bottom of the property. The mountains to the west were doing the thing they did at this hour, going from blue to purple to something that had no name, because it was only there for 20 minutes and then it was dark. Cole's hand was very still, not tense, just present, receiving. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him. Nothing needed to be said, and so nothing was said, which was the way the most important things between them had always worked. Not because they lacked language, but because language had a ceiling, and what they were looking at together was above ceiling. He reached up with his free hand, found the end of her braid. She felt the familiar deliberate movement through her hair, the slight tension and release, the specific knot she'd learned to recognize by the time it took him to tie it. When his hand came away, she reached back and touched what was there. 5th bead. She turned it between her fingers. Not bone, not glass, not metal, not wood. Stone, smooth river stone, small and oval, warm from his pocket. She looked at him, waiting. He pressed his palm flat against her abdomen where his hand had rested. Pressed it there and looked at her and said, "Steady." Just that. The word he'd given the river stone. The word he'd spoken into her hair in a firelit cabin, the first time his throat had remembered how. One word, and it meant everything it always meant when he used it, which was, "This is solid. This will hold. I am here and I am not leaving, and what is happening is real and will remain real, and you are not alone in it." She put her hand over his. Autumn arrived the way autumn arrives in Montana, without negotiating, simply replacing summer with itself overnight and expecting everyone to adjust. The first frost came in the 2nd week of September, and Cole had already banked the garden against it, covered the root vegetables, redistributed the woodpile closer to the cabin door. He had done this before the frost, because he'd read the signs in the grass and the creek, and whatever else he read, that she'd stopped trying to track, because there were too many sources, and the result was always accurate anyway. The cabin was warm. The porch railing was solid. The loft had a window Cole had cut through the north wall, and fitted with oiled cloth, not glass. Glass was for later, and through it, Kianzings, you could see the full length of the creek and the grass and the mountains, everything that was theirs coming into view in order from closest to furthest. She was up there when she heard the wagon arrive. Not Dolan. She'd know Dolan's horses by now. They had a particular quality of having been ridden hard and put away wrong. This was something else. She climbed down from the loft and went outside. Judge Cole's. Alone this time, without his riders, sitting on a plain bay horse with a document case across his lap, wearing the same coat. He raised his hand in greeting, and she raised hers in return. And Cole appeared from somewhere around the south side of the cabin, without explaining where he'd come from. Territorial court in Billings ruled last week, the judge said. He didn't get off his horse. He was the kind of man who delivered news efficiently and didn't require hospitality for it. Dolan's claim rejected. Forgery finding was official. He's been charged with fraud in connection with the Henderson and Morrison properties as well. There'll be a trial in October. Clara held her deed. She'd been carrying it for 11 days since Billings' response had been rumored, not because it needed carrying, but because the habit of holding on to the most important thing she owned had become structural. Is he likely to come back here? Unlikely. He's got lawyers and a trial and 3 county sheriffs with active interest in his activities. Coles glanced at Cole. There may be testimony needed regarding the circumstances of how the fraudulent document was found. Cole looked at the judge, then at Clara. She looked at him. The question was already answered in the way he was standing, which was the way he stood when he'd decided something and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. He'll testify, Clara said. The judge nodded. Good, he turned his horse. I'll send word about the date. Then he paused, looking at the cabin, at the standing walls and the new roof and the fence around the garden and the porch railing and the woodpile stacked with the precision of someone who understood that winter in Montana was not a negotiation. He built that. We built it, Clara said. The judge looked from the cabin to Cole to Clara. Something moved in his face that was the first entirely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. Not quite a smile, but honest, which was rarer. Good, he said again, and went. Cole went back inside. She heard the sound of him moving through the cabin, the specific weight of his footsteps that she had mapped so thoroughly over these months that she could have drawn a diagram of his exact path, into the back room, to the workbench he'd built along the east wall, the knock of the knife handle against the wood surface. She sat on the porch step. Above Harrow Creek, the sky was the specific blue of a Montana October morning, the kind of blue that doesn't exist at any other altitude or latitude, but is there in the high country in the fall, like a promise the summer makes before it leaves. The creek ran small now, the snow melt long past, the water clear over its pale stones. She thought about Caldwell Crossing square, about a rusted cage and a hand-lettered sign, and what a man's eyes look like when he has stopped expecting anything and you show up anyway. She thought about a ring traded for a human being, which was the worst transaction and the best decision she had ever made, and about how sometimes the thing you spend is not the same as the thing you lose. She had not lost the ring. She had spent it on the right thing. Cole came to the porch door. He held something out. She turned and took it. A small piece of cedar, flat, the size of her palm. He had worked it smooth on both sides. On one side, 2 figures in relief, not sitting now but standing, side by side, and between them, smaller, the beginning of a third. She ran her thumb over the third figure. On the other side, carved deep and clean, Reed and Cole, Harrow Creek, 1882. She held the cedar with both hands. Felt the 5 beads at the end of her braid shift against her neck with the motion of her turning it. Felt Ruth's ring in her pocket, carried and witnessed, not put down. She looked up at him in the cabin doorway. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the cage, from across 100 fires, from the near side of every silence they'd built together, not past her, not around her, at her. With the full attention of a man who had learned that the things worth looking at were rare enough that looking away was a cost too high to pay. Come sit with me, she said. He came and sat beside her on the porch step, his shoulder warm against hers, the cedar in her hands between them. The creek ran, the mountains held, the grass bent and straightened in the wind off the ridge that smelled like snow coming, still weeks away but coming, the way everything good comes, announced first by the quality of the air before the thing itself arrives. She did not have everything. She had what was here, what was solid, what had been chosen and built and stayed. She had a cabin with a loft window facing north, and a porch railing she'd built herself, and a garden under its autumn cover, and a man who spoke in beads and cedar, and the working grammar of hands that had never needed translation. She had a third figure in a carving that was still unfinished, which was exactly right, which was the only honest way to carve a thing that was still becoming. She would carry Thomas Reed with her for the rest of her life, the way you carry the people who taught you that love is a practice and not a condition, that it requires daily action and daily choice and daily presence. And she would carry Ruth in her pocket and in the amber bead that meant fire and what survives fire, and she would carry Caldwell Crossing Square as the place where she spent the last thing she had that wasn't needed anymore, on the first thing that was. And here, on a porch above a creek in Montana in the fall, she carried this, Cole beside her, the weight of him familiar as the land, the warmth of his shoulder, something she no longer noticed in the way you stop noticing the foundation of a house. Not because it ceased to matter, but because it has become the condition of everything built above it. She put her hand over the carving on her knee, felt the two standing figures and the small beginning between them. "Steady," she said. He turned and looked at her, and smiled. Not the small, almost smile she'd seen on the road, the one that started and didn't finish. This one arrived and stayed, full and unhurried and wholly his. She looked back at the valley, held on to what she had. Let it be enough, let it be more than enough. Let it be the whole of a thing that had no name yet but was real and solid and ongoing, built from the materials available, from what could be found, from the raw and sufficient fact of two people who had both lost everything and had separately decided that the losing was not the end of the story, just the part before the part that mattered.